This is the story of the ugly duckling, and it starts in the countryside on a farm a long time ago. The farm was home to lots of animals and birds, and down by the river is where the ducks lived. They liked to be near the water because they enjoyed swimming so much. The riverbank was home to the Mallard family. There was Mrs. Mallard, Mr. Mallard, and their nest of 5 eggs. The Mallards looked after the eggs, keeping them warm, waiting for the day when they'd hatch. One day, one of the sheepdogs from the farm came bounding over to Mrs. Mallard. He looked quite worried and needed to speak to her urgently. "Oh, Mrs. Mallard," said the sheepdog, "we need your help. This egg has been found a little way down the riverbank. When the duckling inside hatches out, he'll be all alone. Would you please take the egg and look after it?" "Oh, well, said Mrs. Mallard, hesitating. I already have 5 eggs of my own. It's going to be a bit of a squeeze in the nest, but I'm sure we'll manage." "Thank you so much," said the sheepdog, and he put the egg into the nest along with the others. "Well," said Mrs. Mallard, "now I'm waiting for 6 eggs to hatch. I'm going to be busy." After a few days, the first of the eggs started to crack, and the first of Mrs. Mallard's ducklings broke out of its shell. He was the cutest little bundle of fluffy yellow feathers you've ever seen. He had a very handsome beak and tiny webbed feet, which would be great for swimming. Just then, the next egg started to hatch. Out came another very attractive duckling, this time a girl. "She's so pretty," said Mrs. Mallard. "Reminds me of myself when I was that age." And then another egg started to hatch, and another, and another. Yes, the 5 eggs produced 5 very fine ducklings. This left just 1 egg in the nest, the one found by the sheepdog. But there was no sign of this egg hatching. "Do you think there's anyone in there?" said Mrs. Mallard to Mr. Mallard. Mr. Mallard went over to the egg and tapped it very gently. "Hello?" he said. "Is there anyone in there?" But there was no reply. "I suppose the only thing we can do is wait," he said. So that's what they did. They waited, and waited, and waited. Eventually, after several days of waiting, the egg started to crack. The excitement was enough to gather everyone around the nest. The chickens and the geese ran down from the farm, and the sheepdog bounded over too. Even some of the sheep and cows came to have a look at the latest addition to the Mallard family. They all peered into the nest as the egg cracked a bit more. One of the cows said, I wonder if this duckling will be as pretty as all your others, Mrs. Mallard." The egg cracked a bit more, and a bit more, and then at last a little head popped up through the hole in the shell. Everyone gasped. You see, this little face wasn't like the other ducklings with their fluffy yellow feathers. No, this one was grey, a bit lumpy, had big goggle eyes, and a beak that looked like it was far too big for him. The farm cat was the first to speak. "Well," she said, "he's not going to win any beauty contests." "Bah," said one of the sheep. "He can't help it if he's, well, different looking." "Different?" said one of the chickens. "He's an ugly duckling, that's what he is." The sheepdog couldn't believe what he was hearing. "How can you say such things?" he said. "He may not look like the other ducklings, but that doesn't make him any different from the rest." "Yes," said Mrs. Mallard, "he may not look like my other children, but we still love him just as much." The ugly duckling was given the name Wadley. and over the next few weeks he found life very hard. The chickens often teased Wadley about how grey he was and how his beak looked like it was too big for him. They called him some horrible names too. He tried not to show that he was upset, but when he had time to think, he really did feel very sad. "Why do I look different?" he asked the sheepdog. "Well," said his friend, "it's like this. If we all looked the same, the world would be a very dull place. And anyway, who's to say what's ugly and what's beautiful? The most important thing is how you use what you've got to your best advantage." Wadley knew the sheepdog was right, but still he felt sad. The name-calling from the chickens just seemed to get worse. One day, the farm cat was in a particularly catty mood. "Oi, Ugly," she said. "What's with a funny face? You look like a bad dream I had last night. Quite a nightmare it was." This was as much as Wadley could take. He'd had enough. But instead of just ignoring the cat, he decided to leave the farm and the riverbank for good. "Maybe if I go somewhere else, people will be kinder to me," he thought. So later that day, he packed a bag and headed off, not knowing where he'd go. In the morning, when Mr. and Mrs. Mallard realised Wadley was gone, they were both sad and angry. They were sad because Wadley had been so upset he'd left, and they were angry with the cat and the chickens. It was their name-calling and unkindness which had driven Wadley away. The sheepdog tried to console them. "Don't worry," he said to the Mallards. "Wadley's a resourceful little chap. I'm sure he'll be okay." Wadley's travels took him to lots of different places. He still got some nasty names shouted at him, but not as many as before. He also noticed that some of his grey feathers were dropping out or turning white, but he just put this down to him being different, and he didn't take much notice of it. In fact, every morning when he woke up, he had a few more white feathers and fewer grey ones. The weeks passed, and one day Wadley arrived in a small village. As he made his way up the main street, he noticed everyone looking at him. "Oh no," he thought to himself, "here we go again. It'll only be a matter of time before people are making jokes about me and calling me names." But this time, people didn't make jokes, and they didn't call him names. No, this time they smiled. They said hello too, and they seemed to be pleased to see him. This made Wadley feel a bit uneasy. He stopped to admire a beautiful jacket in the window of a shop. As he looked at it, the shopkeeper came out to meet him. "My, what a fine figure of a chap you are," said the shopkeeper. "A gentleman like you must be looking for something special." "Pardon?" said Wadley. "Me? Fine? Special? No, I'm just an ugly duckling. There's nothing fine or special about me." "Oh, sir," said the shopkeeper, "you must be having a little joke with me. I've never seen such a fine swan. You must be very proud of your plumage." Wadley was confused. "Are you playing a joke on me?" he asked. "I'm not a swan." "Sir," said the shopkeeper, "this is no joke. You are the finest, most handsome swan I have ever seen. Look in my mirror and see for yourself." Wadley craned his neck and looked at his reflection. He couldn't believe what he saw. Gone were the dull grey feathers. Gone was the oversized beak. Yes, all the time his feathers had been changing, he'd been growing up into the most beautiful, elegant swan. "I don't believe it," said Wadley to the shopkeeper. "I'm not an ugly duckling any more. I'm a swan." "You are," said the shopkeeper. "Your family must be very proud of you." Wadley thought of Mr. and Mrs. Mallard and how they'd been so kind to him. So right there and then, he decided to go back to the farm. His new feathers had given him a fine pair of wings, which he flapped and flapped. He'd never been able to fly before, but eventually, and with a bit of practice, he took to the air. Up, up, up he flew, flying high above the countryside. He flew over fields and towns, mountains and the sea. He felt so happy. After some time and a lot of flying, he spotted the farm where he was hatched way, way down below. Gracefully, he swooped down to the river, landing just a little way from the home of Mr. and Mrs. Mallard. At first, no one recognized him in his fine new plumage. After a few minutes, though, his old friend the sheepdog bounded over to him. "Wadley, is it really you?" he said. "Yes," said Wadley, "but I'm not an ugly duckling any more. Look at me. I'm a swan." "I can see that," said the sheepdog, and the animals and birds hurried down to the riverbank to see what was going on. "Aren't you smart?" said the cows. "Very handsome," said the sheep. "And welcome home," said Mr. and Mrs. Mallard, who were so happy to see Wadley back on the riverbank. Just then, the cat and the chickens, who had been so rude to Wadley, pushed their way to the front. The cat was the first to speak. "I'm so sorry for all the names I called you," she said. "I must have really upset you to make you run away." "Yes," said one of the chickens. "We said some unkind things too. All the time you were gone, we wished we could have apologized. We're all very sorry." Wadley could have just ignored the cat and the chickens, but he didn't. You see, being treated so nastily when he was younger made him sure he would never be unkind to anyone. So Wadley accepted their apology and went back to the nest with the Mallards, where he lived happily ever after. Once Wadley was out of earshot, the sheepdog turned to the cat and the chickens. "Your name-calling was enough to drive Wadley away," he said. "Have you learned any lessons from this?" And you know what? They had. They had learned that everyone is different, and that calling names can be very hurtful. They had also learned that when you know you've done something wrong, it really is best to say you're sorry.